He thought he owned everything: the empire, the city, and the woman who kept his secrets for 12 years. He was wrong about all three. This is the story of Roman de Luca, a man who built his throne on fear, buried his wife's name under his own ambitions, and never once stopped to wonder what she was capable of when she finally decided she was done. What happens next will remind you that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone forgot to watch. Stay until the end. You won't see the last move coming. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. I bet. The alarm on Roman de Luca's phone went off at 6:14 a.m., same as every morning, and he silenced it the way he silenced everything that inconvenienced him, fast, without looking, without apology. He was already dressed. He had already been awake for 20 minutes, moving quietly through the pre-dawn dark of a Stamford hotel suite that smelled of expensive perfume and someone else's ambition. He buttoned his shirt in front of the bathroom mirror without turning on the overhead light, working by the pale gray seeping through the window. The city was still asleep. That was how he preferred it. The world quiet, manageable, arranged in the order he had placed it. He checked himself in the mirror for exactly 4 seconds, straightened the collar, ran one hand through his hair, dark and thick, with maybe a thread of silver at the temples that Vanessa said made him look distinguished. He didn't care what it made him look like. He cared that it didn't make him look tired, because tired men made mistakes, and Roman de Luca did not make mistakes. He had told himself that for 12 years. He believed it the same way a man believes in the structural integrity of a bridge, completely, without inspection, because nothing had ever collapsed yet. The suite behind him was quiet in the particular way hotel rooms go quiet in the hour before dawn. Vanessa was still asleep, one bare shoulder above the white sheets, hair spread across the pillow in that practiced way that was never quite as careless as it looked. She was 29. She was beautiful in the manner of things that were designed to be beautiful, deliberately, expensively, with full awareness of the effect. Roman had been sleeping with her for 14 months. He had not told her he loved her. She had told him twice, both times after he had paid a bill larger than most people's annual salary, and he had kissed her forehead in response without saying the word back. He was not a sentimental man. He picked up his jacket from the chair, slid his wallet and his phone into the inside pocket, and left without waking her. He didn't leave a note. He never did. The hotel would charge the room to a corporate card registered to a holding company that no one looking at him in traffic could trace back to Roman de Luca, husband, father, or felon, depending on which set of documents you happen to be reading. The drive home through pre-dawn Connecticut took 23 minutes. He made it in 19. Roman drove the way he conducted business, hard on the accelerator, patient through the turns, always watching 3 moves ahead. The Porsche pushed through the empty streets of Stamford's financial corridor, past the glass towers where his real estate empire had planted its legal face, past the river where the city's old money had once sat in judgment over men like him, past the neighborhoods that had told him 20 years ago that he would never belong. He had outlasted all of it. He had purchased most of it, and he had done it while keeping his hands clean enough that the people who needed to shake them could do so without flinching. It was a carefully calibrated life. He had calibrated every part of it, except perhaps the part that waited for him at home every night, except Isabella. The De Luca estate in Greenwich stood behind iron gates at the end of a private road lined with old oaks, their branches not yet budding in the last grip of March. The house itself was a Georgian colonial, 11,000 square feet, immaculate, with the kind of bone structure that announced generational wealth to anyone educated enough to read it. Roman had bought it because it looked like the kind of house that could not possibly be connected to crime. He had been right. Nobody ever looked twice at a house that beautiful. He punched in the gate code, the same code it had been for 4 years, 1204, Isabella's birthday, and waited for the iron to swing back before pulling through. The driveway lights should have been on. They were set on a timer programmed to stay lit until 7 a.m., and Isabella kept the timers because she kept everything, organized and reliable, and exactly where it was supposed to be. The lights were off. Roman noticed it the way he noticed small irregularities, a flicker of attention, filed and dismissed in under a second, probably a circuit. He'd have the maintenance people look at it. He parked in the circular front drive instead of pulling around to the garage. He was already planning the morning: shower, breakfast, the 8 a.m. call with the Chicago contractors he'd been putting off for 2 weeks. He had an appetite. Vanessa kept a restrictive diet that made meals at her apartment an exercise in minimalism, and Isabella cooked the way his mother had cooked, with the kind of abundance that treated hunger as something to be taken seriously. He was thinking about eggs. He was thinking about coffee. He was thinking about none of the right things. He used his key on the front door. It opened smoothly. The lock hadn't been changed. The foyer was dark. Roman stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand still on the door, and did what he rarely did. He stopped moving. The house had a sound when it was occupied. Not loud, not intrusive, but present. The low hum of appliances. The subtle temperature differential between a heated house and the cold outside. The sense of weight that a space accumulates when someone has been living in it, breathing in it, making coffee in it for 12 years. The house had no sound. He stepped inside. His footsteps were loud on the marble foyer. He reached for the light switch and flipped it, and the chandelier above him blazed on, throwing bright gold across the entryway. And he stood there in the light looking at a house that felt exactly like a stage set, perfectly arranged, perfectly silent, and completely, absolutely empty. Isabella. He said it without urgency, more reflex than concern. She had probably gone out early. A morning walk, or coffee, with one of the neighbors she kept up polite acquaintance with. Except Isabella did not go on morning walks in the last week of March, when the temperature hadn't cracked 40 degrees. And she did not go for coffee before 7 a.m. because she was a disciplined woman who maintained precise and logical routines, which was one of the things Roman had stopped noticing about her somewhere around year 4 of their marriage, in the way that men stopped noticing furniture. He walked through to the kitchen. The kitchen was immaculate. No coffee started. No evidence of a morning meal half prepared. The countertops were bare and clean in a way they were never bare and clean at 6 in the morning, because Isabella was always the first one awake. And by the time Roman came down for breakfast, the kitchen was already in mid-process, warm and purposeful, and smelling of something. It smelled of nothing. And on the kitchen island, in the exact center of the marble surface, was an envelope. It was thick, legal size, cream-colored, the kind of paper that quality law firms use because the weight of it is meant to convey seriousness before you've even opened it. His name was written on the front in Isabella's handwriting, Roman, without any other notation. Not Roman DeLuca, not Mr. DeLuca, just Roman, in her clean, even script, the way she had written his name on birthday cards and travel itineraries and grocery lists and every other document that had passed through their 12 years of shared life. He looked at it for 3 seconds without touching it. Then he picked it up. The seal had been closed with a strip of tape rather than glue, which meant she hadn't used the steam method she used for formal correspondence. She had sealed it quickly. She had wanted him to be able to open it without effort, which told him she wanted him to open it, which told him she had left it for exactly this purpose. To be found, to be read, to land. He opened it at the kitchen island, still in his jacket, still smelling of hotel suite and another woman's perfume, and he pulled out the contents. The first page was a cover letter from a law firm he didn't recognize, Blackthorne, Harrow, and Associates, New Haven, dated 2 days ago. The letterhead was simple and expensive. The letter was 4 paragraphs, and the language was precise and almost gentle in the way that legal language is gentle when the attorneys writing it know they don't need to be combative because they have already won. The second page was the first page of a divorce petition. Petitioner, Isabella Marie DeLuca, née Blackthorne. Roman set the legal papers down and looked at the photographs. There were 47 of them. He counted later, not then. Then he simply looked, turning them one by one on the island counter with a stillness that was not calm, but its opposite. A stillness that happened when the body could not keep up with what the mind was processing, when the signal was too large for the system and the whole machine simply stopped responding while it rebooted. Vanessa at his office. Vanessa at the hotel. A woman before Vanessa, a marketing consultant from Boston, whose name he had almost forgotten, at a restaurant in the meatpacking district. Credit card receipts, hotel invoices on his corporate account, a photograph taken through a window at Vanessa's apartment building that showed Roman's face clearly and precisely in the frame. The photographs were not the work of a private investigator hired in a panic. They were too comprehensive, too patiently assembled. These photographs had been taken over a period of time measured not in weeks but in years. Someone had watched him for years. Someone had followed his movements, documented his patterns, built a case with the methodical calm of a prosecutor who already knew the verdict and was simply completing the paperwork. He put the photographs down. He went upstairs. He already knew what he would find, but he went anyway, because Roman DeLuca was a man who needed to verify things with his own eyes, who did not accept information secondhand, who trusted confirmation over communication. He walked down the upstairs hallway, past the photographs on the wall, the family portraits, the vacation shots from Tuscany and Costa Rica and Tokyo that Isabella had framed and arranged in the careful, curatorial way she approached everything, and pushed open the door to the master bedroom. The room was neat. The bed was made with hospital corners. The throw pillows were arranged with geometric precision. On Isabella's nightstand, nothing. No books, no reading glasses, no the two small items she always kept there, a tube of hand lotion and a framed photograph of her mother that Roman had always found mildly oppressive and had never said so. He opened her wardrobe. The rods were empty. Not stripped in panic, empty the way a room is empty when it has been carefully vacated over time, when the absence is deliberate and planned. There was still the faint cedar smell of the wooden drawers. There were still a few wire hangers spaced at intervals, as if she had left them as a marker. This is where I used to be. He opened her jewelry armoire. It was a piece of furniture that had belonged to her grandmother, dark mahogany with velvet-lined interior drawers that Isabella had shown him once when they were first married, pulling out pieces with the unhurried fondness of a woman who understood that objects could carry time inside them. The velvet drawers were empty. Not every piece. She had left the items he had given her. The anniversary bracelet from year 3. The earrings he'd bought in Milan that she'd said were beautiful, even though he'd bought them in an airport. The items that were from him. Everything that was hers, everything she had brought into the marriage, everything inherited and earned and accumulated independent of him, gone. Roman stood in front of the empty armoire for a long moment. Then he went back downstairs, picked up his phone, and called Vincent Moretti. The phone rang 4 times. Vincent picked up with the cautious voice of a man who had learned over 30 years that early morning calls from Roman DeLuca were either very good or very bad, and were almost never in between. "Tell me something's wrong with your car," Vincent said. "She left." Silence. The specific silence of a man rearranging everything he thought he knew. "Isabella left. Last night, or before, I don't know when." Roman was moving through the house now, checking rooms not because he expected to find her, but because he needed to be moving, needed his body occupied while his mind worked. "She left divorce papers, a law firm out of New Haven, Blackthorne, Harrow, somebody." Another silence. Longer this time. "Blackthorne," Vincent said. "Yeah, Roman." Vincent's voice had changed. It had shifted from the steady, competent register he used for business to something underneath that. Careful, almost reluctant, the tone of a man who had information he had been hoping never to have to deliver. "Did you read the documents?" "I'm reading them now." Roman had gone back to the kitchen, the divorce papers spread on the island under the chandelier light. He was reading through the petition, scanning the dense legal language for the specific claim, and he found it on page 3. He stopped. He read it again. "There's an infidelity clause. In the prenuptial. In the prenuptial." Roman's voice was flat. "I never read the prenuptial." "I know. I had Caruso look it over. He said it was standard." Caruso looked at the financial protections. He didn't read the full document. Vincent paused. "Isabella's family attorneys drafted that prenuptial, Roman. The Blackthorne family attorneys. They put that clause in there. The infidelity clause gives her the shared assets. Everything accumulated during the marriage in both your names, everything where you're joint holders on paper, the mansion, the investment portfolios registered to DeLuca Holdings, the corporate stakes you listed under both names for tax purposes." Roman was very still. "All of it," Vincent said quietly. The number assembled itself in Roman's mind with the brutal clarity of a man who kept close tabs on what he owned. $42 million in real estate, portfolios valued at roughly $28 million at current markets. The Greenwich estate itself, purchased at 7.3, now valued at considerably more. He had built that number over 12 years, built it on the foundation of fear and sweat and the kind of ruthless patience that had cost him more than he'd ever accounted for. And the clause, this one page of legal language he had never bothered to read because he had never imagined a world in which it would matter, had handed it to a woman who he had, for 12 years, considered the least threatening person in his life. Vincent. He kept his voice level. Tell me what you know about Isabella's family. The pause before Vincent answered was the most alarming thing Roman had heard in years. I know, Vincent said slowly, that I should have told you this a long time ago. And I didn't, because you never asked, and because honestly, Roman, you never asked about anything that wasn't directly useful to you in the moment, and she was never directly useful to you, so you never asked. Tell me now. Her father was Edward Blackthorne. You know the name because everyone knows the name, but I don't think you ever put it together with her. Roman knew the name. Blackthorne Capital was old Connecticut money, not new money, not built on the kind of enterprise Roman operated, but accumulated over generations, the kind of wealth that survived recessions and scandals and political administrations by being embedded so deeply in legitimate institutions that it couldn't be separated from them. Blackthorne Capital held positions in banks, in development firms, in infrastructure companies that had built half the East Coast toll roads. It was generational money that had grown so large and so diversified that it was essentially unseeable, present everywhere, visible nowhere. She's the heir, Roman said. Not a question. Sole heir. Her brother died in 2016. You were at the service, Roman, and her mother passed 3 years after that. Edward Blackthorne died 14 months ago. I was at the service, Roman said slowly. You were in Vegas 2 days later. I covered for you with the estate attorneys. I told them you were dealing with a family emergency. Vincent's voice was careful. I should not have done that. Roman put one hand flat on the cold marble of the kitchen island. How much? The Blackthorne estate valued at probate was approximately $460 million. That's the figure that went through the courts. The actual holdings are likely higher. $460 million. His wife was worth $460 million. And he had been sleeping in hotel suites with a woman who wore perfume that cost less than his parking tickets, thinking he was the powerful one. There's more, Vincent said, and his voice had gone very quiet. I need you to listen to me carefully before you do anything. Before you call anyone, before you make any moves, just listen. Talk. She controls Meridian Group. Roman's hand pressed harder against the marble. Meridian Group was the holding company that managed the legitimate financial architecture of his empire. It was the clean layer, the corporation that received funds, processed them through real estate transactions and development contracts, and returned them sanitized and accounted for through channels that 6 layers of legal protection kept separate from Roman's criminal operations. He had built Meridian over 8 years. He had placed it in the hands of a management team he trusted, overseen by a board he had personally selected, and had structured it so that it was legally distinct from him while remaining operationally his. It was the engine under the hood of everything. Isabella was on the board. He knew that. He had put her there himself years ago, as a nominal position, a name on a document, a formality that gave her a sense of participation in his world without giving her any actual authority. Or so he had believed. She holds 51%, Vincent said. Roman didn't speak. Majority stake. She's had it for 3 years. Roman. She's been the controlling shareholder of Meridian since January of 2021, and I did not know this until 40 minutes ago when Meridian's general counsel called me to inform me that there was an emergency board meeting called last night. Roman's voice, when it came, was very flat and very cold. What did they decide? She convened the board at 11 p.m. last night. With majority control, she called a shareholder vote. Vincent's voice sounded genuinely pained. They removed you as chairman, unanimously. I own 43% of... 43% is a minority stake, Roman. You know how boards work. She doesn't have the authority to... She has exactly the authority. She has 51% of a privately held corporation. She called the vote. The resolution passed. The board formally removed you as chairman of Meridian Group at approximately 12:15 this morning, which is approximately the same time you were... Vincent stopped. Go ahead and say it. The same time you were at the hotel in Stamford, Vincent finished without inflection. The access revocation came through at 1 a.m. Your corporate accounts, your corporate credit cards, your executive access to the Meridian systems, all of it suspended pending the completion of the ownership transition. And there's a flag on your passport through the company's legal counsel. They filed a notice with the court regarding the divorce proceeding and the potential for asset dissipation. Roman walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the grounds of the estate were gray in the early morning light, the lawn still winter pale, the hedgerows trimmed with the precision that the groundskeeping service maintained on a monthly schedule that Isabella coordinated because Roman had never once in 12 years arranged his own gardening. He stood at the window and looked at his property, the property that had spent the night quietly becoming someone else's. And he breathed. He breathed with the forced, deliberate rhythm of a man who has trained himself not to show panic, who has stood in rooms where losing control meant losing everything and has learned to wear stillness like armor. But under the stillness, something was happening that Roman DeLuca had not felt in a very long time. Something hot and disorienting and deeply, fundamentally wrong. Fear. Not the sharp, manageable fear of a physical threat. That kind of fear he knew how to use, knew how to channel into action. This was the other kind. The kind that comes when the structure you have lived inside of suddenly reveals itself as a stage set, and you understand that the solidity you trusted was performance, and the ground you stood on was borrowed, and everything you thought you owned was simply being held for you by someone who had always had the right to take it back. Roman, Vincent's voice came through the phone. Are you listening to me? I'm listening. Don't go to the Meridian offices. Your access card won't work and it will look bad. Don't call the board members. She's already talked to them, and any pressure from you right now will be characterized as intimidation. Don't try to move the assets in the investment portfolios. They're frozen pending the divorce proceeding, and any attempt to liquidate will trigger the fraud provisions in the prenuptial. She thought of everything, Roman said. Yes. How long have you... He stopped, reformulated. Did you know she was doing this? No. Vincent's answer was immediate and unqualified. I did not know. I want to be clear about that. Roman believed him. He believed him because Vincent Moretti had been his partner for 22 years, since they were both running errands for an organization that was barely holding itself together in the mid-90s, since they had built everything from nothing together, and because Roman was an excellent reader of men and he knew Vincent's voice in every register. The voice on the phone was a man who was genuinely alarmed and genuinely in the dark, which was not reassuring, because if Isabella had managed to execute this without Vincent knowing, she was operating at a level of patience and intelligence that Roman had not credited her with, and that was a failure of observation that was entirely his own. Get to my house, Roman said. Roman, get to the house. I need you here. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen of the house that was no longer his, or that would not be his, depending on how the courts moved, depending on how quickly the divorce proceeding advanced. And he looked at the divorce papers on the island and the photographs spread beside them, and he looked at the envelope in which they had arrived, centered on the marble, with the careful intentionality of a woman who had wanted everything in its right place. She had always wanted everything in its right place. He had understood that about her as a quality, a domesticity, a kind of useful orderliness that made his life run smoothly. He had never understood it as intelligence. He had never understood that a woman who spent 12 years paying attention to the precise arrangement of her environment was a woman who paid attention to everything. That precision was not a personality trait, but a discipline. That the same mind capable of placing a throw pillow at exactly the right angle was capable of executing a 12-year exit strategy with the same methodical, unhurried care. He picked up the photographs again. He looked at the dates printed in the lower right corners of the digital prints. The earliest one was from 4 years ago. 4 years of documentation. 4 years of quiet, consistent, invisible surveillance, while he moved through his life with the breezy confidence of a man who had confused his wife's silence for ignorance. He turned the photographs face down on the island. He went upstairs to shower. Not because he felt clean or wanted to be clean, but because he needed to be doing something. And the shower was a place where he could stand in hot water and think without his face giving anything away to an empty house. He stood under the water long after the temperature he'd wanted had leveled off, and he thought about Isabella. Not the woman he had been married to for 12 years, but the woman in the photograph she had sent him. The woman who had stood on the steps of the federal courthouse in New Haven 2 years ago in a shareholder dispute he vaguely remembered reading about, he'd never attended, and who had been described in the caption of that newspaper photograph, which he had obviously never seen, as Isabella Blackthorne, the majority stakeholder and strategic director of Meridian Group. He had never Googled his own wife. He had never considered that she might be worth Googling. He dressed. He went back downstairs. He made coffee because the machine was still there, still his, and because he needed the ritual of something ordinary. He was standing at the counter waiting for the coffee to finish when he heard the sound of a vehicle on the gravel drive and looked through the kitchen window to see a black town car pulling to a stop behind his Porsche. A woman got out of the back. She was wearing a black designer suit. Her dark hair was pulled up. She moved with the deliberate, unhurried composure of someone who had already finished being nervous and was now on the other side of it, in the clear air where only certainty existed. Behind her, 2 men in suits got out. Attorneys, by the look of them, briefcases, the carefully assembled neutral expressions of legal professionals. Behind them, another car, a Range Rover, from which 2 people emerged who were not carrying briefcases and whose presence was meant to be read as a specific kind of message. Private security. Isabella DeLuca, Isabella Blackthorne, stood in the driveway of the Greenwich estate and looked at the house the way Roman imagined a general might look at a position they had been planning to take for a very long time. Roman set down his coffee cup. He walked to the front door and opened it. The March air hit him cold. They stood 15 feet apart, Roman in the doorway and Isabella on the drive, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He looked at her face. He had looked at her face 10,000 times in 12 years, across dinner tables, in airports, in the morning when she woke up and the careful presentation wasn't yet assembled. And he had not, he understood now, actually seen it in a very long time. He had stopped looking. The way you stop looking at a lamp. She was looking at him, directly, steadily, without the flinch or the appeal that he had unconsciously expected. This was what she looked like, he realized, when she wasn't performing the role he had assigned her. This was the face she had underneath the face he knew. Isabella. His voice came out measured. We need to talk. We've needed to talk for a very long time, she said. Her voice was calm, not soft, calm. There was a difference. I didn't want to talk anymore. You're taking my house. Our house. I'm taking my half. She glanced at the attorney beside her, who nodded slightly. The valuation is in the documents. You can have your attorneys review it. You froze my accounts. Meridian's board froze the accounts as part of the asset preservation order. That's standard procedure in a contested divorce involving shared corporate interests. She met his eyes. You should have read the prenuptial, Roman. The cold was beginning to work its way through his shirt. He hadn't grabbed a jacket when he came to the door, and he wasn't going back inside to get one, because going back inside meant ceding the doorway, and Roman DeLuca did not cede ground. He stood in the cold and felt it and didn't move. This is a betrayal, he said. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. The distant cousin of one. I've been documenting your betrayals for 4 years, she said. I have 47 photographs and 14 months of financial records and 3 separate sworn statements from individuals who... She stopped herself. Reset. Her composure was extraordinary. I'm not going to do this in the driveway. The attorneys will handle the process. You'll have access to the documents. You built a case against me. I protected myself from a man who never once thought I was worth protecting. Her voice was still steady, but there was something under it now. Not anger, because anger was too simple. Something more like the exhale after a very long-held breath. Every decision I've made in the past 4 years has been about making sure I could walk out of this marriage without leaving anything behind that I built. I am not leaving anything behind. Roman's jaw was tight. He could feel it, the pressure in his molars, the way his body defaulted to physical tension when the situation exceeded its usual methods. He wanted to say something that would puncture this composure, find the edge and press it, the way he could do with anyone. He had always been able to do that. He was good at finding edges. He looked at her and could not find one. You planned this for years, he said. You were planning this while we were... He stopped. The word he'd been about to use was married, and the word suddenly felt so inadequate that he couldn't make himself say it. This whole time, I started planning this the day I found the hotel receipt in your jacket pocket, Isabella said. Not the first hotel receipt I found. The third. That was the day I understood that this was not a mistake you were going to correct. That day I called my family's attorneys and I told them what I needed. She paused. And they told me to be patient. So I was patient. She turned toward his house. She had turned her back to him, moving toward the front door with the quiet finality of someone walking back into a room that was already hers. And Roman felt something tear open in his chest. Not love, because he was not sure he had ever loved her in the way the word was supposed to mean, but something that might have been the loss of something he hadn't known he valued until this exact moment. He said, without planning to say it, "Was any of it real?" She stopped. Her back was still to him. One beat of silence. "I was real," she said quietly. "Every day for 12 years, I was real. You just never looked." She walked into the house. He stood on the cold front steps of the Greenwich estate and watched his attorney's car pull up behind Isabella's, watched Vincent's dark BMW pull behind that, watched the driveway fill with the agents of his own dismemberment, and felt the specific vertigo of a man who has spent his entire life in motion, suddenly finding himself completely, perfectly still. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A number he didn't recognize. He answered, "Mr. DeLuca." A woman's voice. Professional. Crisp. "This is Meridian Group's General Counsel. I'm calling to inform you that pursuant to the board resolution passed at 12:15 this morning, your executive access to all Meridian systems and properties has been suspended effective immediately. You will receive formal written notice within 24 hours. If you have questions regarding the—" Roman ended the call. Vincent was getting out of his BMW, moving toward the house with the purposeful speed of a man who understood urgency. Roman watched him come. Behind Vincent, in the second-floor window of the mansion, he could see movement. Isabella moving through the space with the attorneys, walking through her own house with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had already decided what was hers. "Tell me we have options," Roman said when Vincent reached the steps. Vincent looked at him, and in his old friend's face Roman read something he had not seen there in 22 years of partnership. Not alarm, not concern, something quieter and more irreversible. Grief. "Tell me," Roman said again. Vincent took a breath. "I found something this morning," he said slowly, "that I think you need to know about before we talk about options. Something about Vanessa." Roman went very still. "What about Vanessa?" Vincent pulled out his phone. He held up the screen. It was a photograph. Vanessa King, at a restaurant table, leaning across toward a man Roman didn't recognize at first, and then did. A man from the Meridian board. A man who had been at the table when they voted Roman out 4 hours ago. "She's been meeting with Meridian's attorney for 6 months," Vincent said. "I don't know everything yet, but Roman—" He looked at the photograph for a long time. "How long have you known?" Roman said. "Since this morning." "How long has she known about Isabella's plan?" Vincent didn't answer, which was an answer. Roman looked up at the second-floor window of his mansion. He looked at the photograph in Vincent's hand. He looked at the gray March sky above his own driveway and understood, in one compressed and brutal moment of clarity, that the trap he was standing in was not a trap that had been set last night, or last month, or even 4 years ago when Isabella had made her call to the family attorneys. It had been set the moment he had decided that the women around him were furniture, and he had walked into it willingly, cheerfully, without once looking down. His phone buzzed again. This time the number was Vanessa's. He stared at her name on the screen. He did not answer. And upstairs, in the second-floor window of the mansion, the light went out. Roman answered the phone on the 5th buzz. Not Vanessa's call. He had let that one die. This was a number he didn't recognize, a 203 area code, and he answered it because at this point information was the only currency he had left, and he could not afford to let any of it go to voicemail. "Mr. DeLuca," male voice, mid-40s, the particular flatness of someone paid to deliver bad news without effect. "I'm calling from Greenwich Property Management on behalf of the estate's new primary account holder. We've been instructed to inform you that the access codes for the property gates and security system will be updated at 9 a.m. this morning. If you have personal items you'd like to retrieve from the premises, you'll need to coordinate through Blackthorn. Harrow and Associates and schedule a supervised. Roman ended the call. He looked at Vincent. Vincent was standing 3 feet away on the front steps, close enough that Roman could see the precise moment when his old friend decided not to say anything and instead just held the silence the way you hold something fragile. "Inside," Roman said. "They're in there, Roman. It's still my house until a judge says otherwise." He walked past Vincent and through the front door. The foyer was occupied now. One of Isabella's attorneys was standing near the base of the staircase with an open briefcase and a legal pad, talking quietly into a phone. He looked up when Roman entered. He did not step aside. He simply watched, with the careful neutrality of a man who had been briefed on exactly this scenario and had been told exactly how to handle it, which was to do nothing that could be characterized as confrontation, but to be physically present as a witness to everything. Roman walked past him. He walked through to his study, the room at the back of the house. His room, the one space in the mansion that Isabella had never redesigned or reorganized after their second year, because he had told her clearly that he did not want her in it, and she had accepted that. And now he understood that her acceptance had not been submission but strategy, because the room she never entered was also the room she had never been seen entering, which meant anything she found out about what happened inside it had come from other means entirely. He sat down behind his desk. He put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall of bookshelves opposite him. Law books, business texts, the 2 or 3 actual novels he'd read in the past decade, placed there mostly for appearance, and he breathed. In through the nose. 4 counts. Out through the mouth. It was a discipline he had developed in his early 30s when he had first begun operating at a level where visible panic could get a man killed. He had practiced it so long it was automatic now. The same way certain things in the body become automatic. Heartbeat, blink, the maintenance of a face that does not betray what is happening behind it. Vincent came in and closed the door. He sat across from Roman without being invited to sit, which was the prerogative of 22 years. And he put his phone on the desk between them, face up, the photograph of Vanessa and the Meridian attorney still on the screen. "Walk me through it," Roman said. "I got a call from Marco at 7 this morning. He monitors the surveillance rotation at the Meridian offices. You set that up in 2019, he reports directly to me. He flagged the attorney because he'd seen him twice before in the past 3 months, in contexts that didn't make sense for routine legal business. Once at a restaurant in Westport that Vanessa frequents. Once at a parking garage in Stamford, 2 blocks from her building." Vincent paused. Marco pulled the restaurant footage. They were there for 2 hours. "What's the attorney's name?" "David Harrow." Roman was quiet for 3 seconds. "Harrow as in Blackthorne, Harrow and Associates." "As in Isabella's family law firm, yes." Roman leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. The plaster up there was original to the house. 1890-something, hand-finished, the kind of craftsmanship that no one did anymore. Isabella had pointed that out to him when they first bought the place. Standing in this room, her head tipped back at the same angle his was now, her voice full of that particular warmth she had for old things, for things that had lasted. He had been thinking about the square footage. "She was feeding them information," Roman said. "That's my read." "For how long?" "I don't know. Based on what Marco showed me. At minimum 6 months, possibly longer." "What kind of information?" Vincent looked at him steadily. "The kind that would be useful to someone building a case." Roman brought his gaze back down from the ceiling and looked at his oldest friend. Vincent was 61, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome in his 40s and had settled into something harder and more reliable with age. He had a scar on his left jaw from 2003 that Roman had been present for. He had been in the room for every significant decision Roman had made in the past 2 decades, had stood beside him at a funeral for a man they had both ordered killed, had kept secrets that could put them both away for consecutive lifetimes. "You said you didn't know," Roman said, "about Isabella's plan." "I didn't. But you knew about Vanessa." "I knew something was off about Vanessa." Vincent's voice was careful and precise, the voice of a man choosing each word the way you choose footing on unstable ground. "I had suspicions. 3 weeks ago, I noticed a pattern in Marco's surveillance reports that suggested she was meeting with someone connected to the corporation, but I hadn't confirmed it yet. I was still running it down. 3 weeks ago." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." I was confirming it first, Roman. I don't bring you speculation. You've told me that yourself 100 times. Don't bring me speculation. Bring me facts. I was getting the facts. The room was very quiet. Through the closed study door, Roman could hear the low murmur of voices. The attorney on his phone, possibly Isabella in another room, the functional sounds of his house being professionally repossessed. He focused on Vincent's face, and he looked for the thing he had been looking for all morning, the thing that would tell him how much of his own world had turned while he wasn't watching. You should have told me 3 weeks ago, Roman said. Yes. Vincent did not look away. I should have. Because if I had what? You would have done what exactly? Vincent's voice sharpened, and it was the first time this morning that something other than caution had come through it, a threat of something older and more complicated. Ended it with her? You've been with her for 14 months, Roman. I've watched you become less careful, less attentive, less present. You stopped coming to the board meetings at Meridian 8 months ago. You stopped attending the quarterly reviews. You sent proxies, which meant you sent men who didn't have your authority, which meant that when Isabella moved on, the majority position, no one at that table understood what was at stake, because the man who should have been there wasn't. Boy, gosh, I did. He paused. Let that land. So tell me, if I had come to you 3 weeks ago with incomplete intelligence about a woman you were in love with, I'm not in love with her. Then what have you been doing for 14 months? The question sat between them on the desk like the photograph beside it, and Roman had no answer that wasn't also an indictment, so he gave no answer at all. Vincent picked up his phone. He put it back in his jacket pocket. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture Roman had seen from him rarely, only in moments of genuine exhaustion. And then he folded his hands on the desk in front of him and looked at Roman with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is deciding whether to set it down. We need to talk about what you actually have left, Vincent said. Talk. The Meridian accounts and the corporate assets are frozen pending the divorce. The estate and the investment portfolios are contested under the prenuptial claim. That's approximately $70 million in assets that are currently inaccessible. He said it without softening it. What you have uncontested, the DeLuca family trust, which you structured as a separate legal entity before the marriage. The offshore positioning in the Cayman arrangement. The liquidity you keep in the private account in New Haven. I don't know the current balance on that. $2.3 million. That's your operating capital until the courts move, which could be 6 months, could be 18. The Cayman funds. Touch those and you trigger a reporting obligation that neither of us wants triggered right now. Vincent met his eyes. There are people who have been waiting for an excuse to look closely at certain transactions from 2018 and 2019. If you start moving money offshore in the middle of a divorce proceeding, you give them the excuse. Roman drummed 2 fingers on the desk once, twice, stopped. The organization, he said. Vincent was quiet for a moment. What about it? The East Coast operations, the Keller arrangement, the distribution network through the Bridgeport contacts. Those are mine. Independently mine. Isabella doesn't have a position in any of that. The organization is not something we discuss in this house right now, Vincent said, with a precision and firmness that Roman registered as its own kind of message. He glanced toward the closed door. Not today. Not with her attorneys 20 feet away. Roman nodded once. Fair. Then I need to get out of this house, Roman said. Where will you go? It was a simple question, and Roman did not have an answer for it, which was so profoundly wrong that for a moment he simply sat with the wrongness of it and let it be what it was. He was a man with a net worth that had been, as of yesterday, somewhere north of $100 million, including the Blackthorne inheritance he hadn't known about, and was now in no position to claim, and he did not know where he was going to sleep tonight. He thought of Vanessa's apartment. He dismissed the thought almost simultaneously with having it. The Stamford Hotel, he said. They ran the card this morning. The corporate card is frozen. Vincent paused. I can cover it. You're not covering my hotel room. Roman, you're not. He stood up. The movement was abrupt enough that Vincent sat back slightly, not in alarm but in the careful recalibration of a man giving space. Roman walked to the window of the study and looked out at the back lawn. The garden that Isabella had planted with some deliberate philosophy he had never bothered to ask about, the stone path leading to the far hedge, the ornamental trees still bare in the March cold. I'm going to call Vanessa. Roman, don't. I need to hear it from her. You do not need to hear it from her. I have the photograph. I have Marco's report. I need to hear it from her. He said it with a finality that closed the subject, and Vincent recognized the tone and stopped pushing, the way he always stopped pushing when Roman hit that register, which was the register just before something irreversible happened. Roman called her from the study window, his back to Vincent, looking at the winter-gray garden. She answered on the second ring. Roman. Her voice was warm and immediate in the way of someone who had been waiting for this specific call and had decided in advance how to play it. I've been trying to reach you. I heard something was meridian, Roman said. Silence. Not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But 3 seconds is a very long time when you are listening for the shape of a lie forming. I don't know what you mean, Vanessa said. David Harrow, Roman said. Blackthorn, Harrow and Associates, Westport Restaurant. 6 months of meetings. He paused. Tell me what you mean. Another silence. This one different. The quality of it changed, went flat, the warmth draining out of it the way color drains from a face. I was going to tell you, she said. When? When the time was when, Vanessa? This isn't, Roman, this isn't how I wanted this to go. I was trying to protect myself. I didn't know how serious it was going to get, and they approached me. They came to me first, and I didn't. She stopped, reorganized. When she started again, her voice had lost the warmth entirely and found something else. Not coldness exactly, but the stripped-down pragmatism of someone who has decided the performance is no longer necessary. I needed to know what was going to happen. To me, to my situation. They told me what Isabella was planning, and I needed to know if there would be anything left. If there was going to be anything left for you, Roman said. Yes. A beat. For me. He looked at the garden, the bare ornamental trees, the stone path leading nowhere particular. Did you give them information about the organization? He said. No. Fast. Too fast. I don't know anything about... I would never... What did you give them? The silence this time was the longest yet. Through it, Roman could hear her breathing, could hear the soft ambient sound of her apartment. A city sound, traffic, the distant signature of a life that had been furnished partly with his money and partly with whatever arrangement she had made with Isabella's attorneys. Financial records, she said finally. Things I'd seen, statements, receipts, things you left at my place, Roman. I didn't steal anything. I kept copies of things that passed through. He ended the call. He stood at the window for a moment longer. Then he turned from the glass and walked back to the desk and picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd draped it and put it on. She gave them financial records, he said to Vincent. His voice was extraordinarily level. Vincent closed his eyes briefly. How much? I don't know yet. He picked up his phone, his wallet, enough that she felt it was worth 6 months of meetings with Isabella's attorney. Roman, Vincent stood up. I need you to think carefully about what you do next, not feel, think. Because if you go to that apartment right now in the state you're in... I'm not going to the apartment. Roman looked at him. I'm going to the hotel. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to think. And then I'm going to call Marcus Chen and I'm going to find out exactly how much damage has been done to this operation, and then I'm going to figure out how to take back what's mine. He moved toward the door. Are you with me? It wasn't really a question. It had never really been a question in 22 years. Vincent picked up his own jacket. I'm with you. They walked out of the study. The attorney near the staircase looked up and tracked them across the foyer with the steady, unreadable gaze of a professional witness. Roman did not look at him. He walked to the front door and opened it and stepped out into the cold March air, and Vincent came out behind him, and they stood on the front steps of the house that had stopped being Roman's sometime in the last 14 hours. Then Roman heard footsteps on the staircase inside and turned. Isabella came down the stairs. She was still in the black suit, still composed, and beside her was a man Roman recognized after a beat. Tall, dark-haired, maybe 50, with the particular quiet confidence of someone who has spent a long time being competent in rooms where competence was required. One of the Meridian board members, one of the men who had voted to remove Roman at 12:15 in the morning. Roman looked at the man. The man held his gaze without expression. Isabella looked at Roman. "You'll hear from our attorneys about the asset schedule," she said. Practical. Final. "Who is he?" Roman said. "Marcus Ellery. He's been named interim chairman of Meridian pending the transition." Roman looked at Ellery. Ellery looked back. Something passed between them. Not a threat exactly, but the registration of one, the mutual acknowledgement of opposing forces. "I built that company," Roman said. Not to Isabella, to Ellery. Ellery said nothing. "Marcus," Isabella said quietly, and Ellery moved past Roman and Vincent and out to the waiting car, and Isabella stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking at her husband with an expression that Roman could not name because it was too complicated for one word. Not triumphant, not sad, not angry, something that included all three and had moved beyond all three into something more like the resolution of a very long equation. "You should go, Roman," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he should have been looking at her for years, attentively, fully, with the recognition that this person in front of him was not furniture, not backdrop, not the quiet administrative function of a life he had designed around himself. He looked at her, and he finally, at this profoundly late hour, actually saw her. And what he saw was that she was not afraid of him, had never been afraid of him, and that the entire architecture of his confidence, in this marriage, and in the power he believed he held over every person within his orbit, had been built on the assumption that everyone around him operated from fear. That fear was the engine. That fear was what kept the world in its assigned positions. She wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid. She had been patient. "This isn't over," he said. She looked at him for one long moment. "Roman," she said, and her voice was not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been. "It was over the day you decided I didn't matter enough to be careful." She turned and walked back up the stairs. He stood in the doorway of his house and watched her go. And then Vincent's hand was on his arm. Not gripping, just present, just the physical weight of 22 years saying, "Come on, come away, there's nothing left to do here." And Roman turned from the doorway and walked down the front steps to Vincent's car and got in, and the door closed, and the iron gate at the end of the drive opened at the code that would stop working in 40 minutes. They drove through the gate. They drove in silence for 6 minutes. Then Vincent said carefully, "Marcus Chen called me while you were on the phone with Vanessa." Roman looked at him. He pulled the financial forensics on the Meridian accounts going back 18 months. Vincent kept his eyes on the road. His voice was the flattest Roman had ever heard it. "Roman, the offshore Cayman account, the one you use for the organization's liquidity buffer, there's a flag on it." "A flag? Federal?" "Entered into the system 4 days ago." Vincent paused. "Someone filed an informational disclosure with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, specifically naming the account, specifically naming the transaction pattern from 2019 that we've always kept clean." He paused again. "The disclosure was filed by an individual party, not a corporation, not an attorney." Roman was very still. "The filing name," Vincent said, "is Vanessa King." The car moved through the empty Greenwich streets, past the old oaks, past the river, past the glass towers of the legitimate world. Roman sat in the passenger seat with both hands loose in his lap and looked at the road ahead. And the road ahead was very long and very. The car moved through the empty Greenwich streets, past the old oaks, past the river, past the glass towers of the legitimate world, and Roman sat in the passenger seat with both hands loose in his lap and looked at the road ahead. And the road ahead was very long and very straight, and he said nothing for 40 seconds. Then he said, "Pull over." Vincent pulled to this curb on a residential street 3 blocks from the estate. A row of bare maples. A house set back behind a stone wall. Nobody out yet. The world still cold and gray and barely morning. Roman got out of the car. He stood on the sidewalk in the March air without his jacket. He had left it in the study, he realized. He had put it on and then taken it off again at some point, and he didn't remember which point. And he stood there with the cold working through his shirt and his hands at his sides, and he breathed. In through the nose. The discipline. Except this time the discipline didn't hold the way it usually held, because this time the thing it was supposed to contain was too large for the container. Vanessa had filed a federal disclosure. He said it to himself once, silently, the way you repeat something you've read wrong to make sure you read it correctly. And then he said it again, and both times it meant the same thing. She had walked into a federal building, or called a federal tip line, or contacted an attorney who had filed on her behalf, and she had named the Cayman account. She had named the 2019 transactions, the ones Roman had spent 3 years believing were clean, buried under enough layers of corporate documentation to be genuinely undetectable without a specific lead pointing investigators directly at the right number. She had given them the number. 4 days ago, 3 days before Isabella filed for divorce. He looked at the street. He looked at his own hands. They were steady, which surprised him, because the rest of him was not steady. The rest of him was doing something he had no vocabulary for, some internal reorganization of fundamental assumptions that felt less like anger and more like the sensation of a floor dropping away mid-step, the stomach lurch of structural failure. Vincent got out of the car. He stood on the sidewalk 5 feet back and said nothing, because he had known Roman long enough to know when to give him the 5 feet. It was coordinated, Roman said. Yes. The filing, the board meeting, the divorce papers, all of it on the same night. The filing was 4 days ago, which suggests the federal process was already moving before the divorce. She didn't file the disclosure as a response to being exposed. She filed it as part of the plan. Roman turned to look at Vincent. The disclosure was the opening move, not the divorce. Vincent was quiet. Which means Isabella knew about the Cayman account, Roman said. She knew about the 2019 transactions. She gave that information to Vanessa to file, or Vanessa found it through the records she was copying and Isabella's attorneys told her which ones mattered. He paused. Either way, Isabella's attorneys have been building a federal referral package while simultaneously building the divorce case. 2 tracks. It appears that way. And the divorce filing, the board removal, the asset freeze, that's not the end game. That's the distraction. The thing designed to make me focus here, in this state, on these assets, while the federal process develops in the background without me throwing resources at it. He said it clearly and without hesitation because it was simply true, laid out in front of him now with the terrible clarity of something obvious that you have been too close to see. The divorce was the noise. The federal exposure was the blade. Vincent walked over and stood beside him. They stood on the empty sidewalk together in the cold. She's been talking to federal investigators, Roman said. Not a question. I think so. How long? I don't know. Longer than we'd want. Roman laughed. It was a short, rough sound that had nothing to do with anything being funny. The kind of sound a body makes when the alternative is something worse. She cooperated with regulators, he said. That's what you told me on the phone this morning. You said she'd launched audits and cooperated with regulators. In the context of Meridian's internal restructuring, I thought it was standard compliance. She was cooperating with the FBI. The words sat on the cold air between them. Vincent did not deny it. Roman walked back to the car and got in. Vincent got in. They sat. Marcus Chen, Roman said. What exactly did he tell you about the flag on the account? The flag was entered into the FinCEN database 4 days ago as an informational disclosure under the Bank Secrecy Act. The filing specifically identifies the account number, the institution, and references a transaction pattern that matches our 2019 structure. Vincent paused. FinCEN disclosures of this type are typically followed by a formal investigation request within 30 to 90 days. 30 to 90 days. Under normal circumstances. Given that the disclosure is specific and sourced, meaning it names an account and a pattern, which is more actionable than a general tip, the timeline could compress. Roman looked out the window. A woman was walking a dog on the other side of the street, a large retriever, moving at a pace that suggested they did this every morning at this time, that this was simply a Tuesday in March, and the world continued on its ordinary Tuesday schedule, regardless of what was collapsing on this side of the street. I need to talk to a criminal defense attorney, Roman said. Yes, not Caruso. Someone outside the corporate structure, someone with no existing connection to Meridian or the organization. I know someone in Manhattan, Richard Falk. He's the best in the country for federal exposure cases. Call him. It's 7:40 in the morning. Call him. Vincent called. The phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail, and Vincent left a message that was brief and businesslike and included the words urgent and today and a callback number. He hung up. They drove to the Stamford Hotel. Not the one Roman had been using. That one was connected to the frozen corporate card and compromised by Vanessa's awareness of it. But a different one, a Marriott off I-95 that had no connection to any of Roman's established patterns. Vincent paid for the room in cash from the folded bills he kept in his coat for operational contingencies. Roman had been the one who told him to always carry cash for operational contingencies. 12 years ago. In a different context, for different contingencies. The room was clean and anonymous and smelled of industrial laundry. Roman sat on the edge of the bed in his shirt with the curtains open and the gray March light coming through the window, and he put his phone on the nightstand and looked at it. 11 missed calls, 3 from numbers he didn't recognize, 2 from board members at Meridian who had voted against him at midnight and were now apparently trying to reach him, which meant either conscience or curiosity or something more strategic. 1 from his personal attorney, Caruso. 1 from a number with a New Haven area code that he was fairly certain, based on everything else that had happened this morning, was the law firm Blackthorne, Harrow, and associates calling to deliver another piece of procedural news. 3 from Vanessa. He looked at Vanessa's 3 calls the way you look at something you've stepped on in the dark, with the cold retroactive awareness of what it was and where it had been all along. He had slept beside this woman. He had told her things. Not everything, never everything, but things, fragments and confidences, and the particular unguarded observations that escape a man in the hours before sleep when the performance is too exhausting to maintain. He had told her about the 2019 arrangement. He was certain of it now. He could feel the specific memory trying to assemble itself. A night at her apartment. A glass of something. Her asking a question that had seemed like interest rather than investigation. He had answered it. He had answered it because he had believed she was safe. He had believed she was safe because she wanted things from him. Money, access, the social elevation of a particular kind of man's attention. And people who want things from you are controllable, and controllable people are safe. That was the logic. That was the logic he had used for 14 months. It was the same logic he had used about Isabella. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there looking at the parking lot below and the interstate beyond it, and the hard gray sky above all of it, and he felt, with a physical precision, he could locate in his sternum the exact weight of being a man who had spent his entire adult life reading people and had spent the last 12 years being profoundly, catastrophically wrong about the 2 women who had been closest to him. His phone rang. The Manhattan number. Mr. DeLuca. Richard Falk's voice was alert despite the hour. The voice of a man who had learned that early morning calls from new clients were always expensive, which meant they were also always important. Vincent Moretti left me a message. He said urgent. I have a federal disclosure filed 4 days ago against a private account. FinCEN. The account is connected to a transaction pattern from 2019. A pause. Short, professional. Go on. The disclosure was filed by an individual party, a private citizen with direct personal access to information about the account obtained through a personal relationship with me. Has anyone contacted you directly? Investigators, federal agents? Not yet. Okay. Do not speak to anyone who identifies themselves as a federal investigator without counsel present. Anyone? That means if someone calls your cell phone, says they're from the FBI, and asks you an apparently innocent question about the weather, you say you'll have your attorney call them back. Understood? Understood. I can meet you today. My office, noon. I'll be there. He hung up. He sat back on the edge of the bed. He rubbed both hands over his face and held them there for a moment, pressed against his eyes. And in the dark behind his hands, he let himself feel, briefly, what he had been not feeling since he walked into the kitchen of the Greenwich estate and found the envelope on the island. The specific, annihilating feeling of a man who has looked up and discovered that the landscape around him is not what he thought it was, and has not been for a very long time. Then he dropped his hands. He picked up his phone. He called Marcus Chen. Chen answered immediately. He always answered immediately. It was one of the qualities Roman valued in him. He was 38, a forensic accountant who had worked for Roman for 6 years, careful and humorless, and completely without sentimentality, which made him the ideal person for the kind of work Roman needed from him. "Tell me what else you found," Roman said. "I was going to call you this morning," Chen said. "I found something last night, but I wanted to verify it before. Tell me." "The 2019 transactions." Chen's voice was precise and unhurried. "I went back through the documentation structure on those, the Shell Corporation arrangement we used to buffer the Cayman positioning. There's a gap in the record chain. A document that should exist as part of the compliance layer doesn't exist. It was filed with the holding company in the Caymans in March of 2019, and it would have been a routine authorization signature. Your signature. I signed everything from that period. You signed what was put in front of you. What I'm saying is that the document I'm looking at in the Meridian archive, the authorization that connects you directly to the account structure, it isn't a copy of what you signed. The signature is yours. The date is correct. But the document attached to that signature is not the document you signed." Roman was completely still. "The document you signed," Chen said carefully, "authorized a standard intercorporate transfer as part of the Meridian restructuring. Routine. Nothing actionable. The document in the archive carrying your signature authorizes the establishment of an external account structure with language that places you as the sole beneficial owner of the Cayman position and explicitly describes its purpose in terms that no compliance attorney would ever have put in writing." "Someone swapped the document," Roman said. "Someone attached your signature to a document you never signed." "Yes." "When?" "Based on the metadata. And metadata can be altered, I want to be clear about that. But based on the raw file timestamps, the document in the archive was created 14 months ago. 14 months. The same month Roman had begun his relationship with Vanessa King. He looked at the wall of the hotel room, plain white, anonymous. He looked at it the way you look at something when your eyes need somewhere to go and nowhere is right. "Who had access to the Meridian archive during that period?" Roman said. "Board members, the legal team, the executive assistants on the 4th floor. Chen paused. "And anyone with administrator-level system access, which as of 14 months ago included 2 newly credentialed users added to the system by the IT department at the direction of the General Counsel. Names. The credential logs show the additions were authorized by David Harrow, Isabella's attorney, the man who had been meeting with Vanessa at the Westport restaurant for 6 months, the man who had apparently been inside the Meridian system long enough and with sufficient access to locate a document bearing Roman's signature and replace it with one that described in explicit terms a criminal financial arrangement, and then wait for someone to file a federal disclosure pointing investigators directly toward the archive. A fabricated paper trail, built with his own signature. Roman stood up from the bed. He walked to the window. He walked back. He sat down. He stood up again. He was not a pacer. He had spent decades cultivating the stillness that commanded rooms, but his body had exceeded the capacity of the stillness and it needed to move. "Can you prove the swap?" Roman said. "I can demonstrate the metadata anomaly. Whether that rises to the standard of proof required to... Can you prove it?" A pause. "I can build a strong technical argument. But Roman, if this goes to a federal proceeding, the government will have their own forensic people who will look at the same data and argue the opposite. Metadata can be explained either way. What I can't overcome is the fact that your signature is on that document. Whatever document it is, your signature is genuine." Roman put his phone down on the nightstand without ending the call. He looked at it. Chen's voice continued, small and tinny from the speaker, saying something about the options for challenging the evidentiary chain, and Roman let the words move through the air of the hotel room without processing them because he was working through a different calculation. He had been set up, not the crude kind of setup, not planted evidence, not a frame assembled in a hurry. This was the other kind, the kind that takes time, the kind that uses a man's own habits, his own laziness, his own fundamental assumption that the people closest to him were either controllable or irrelevant, and it uses those habits as the mechanism of the trap. He had signed documents he didn't read. He had trusted systems he didn't monitor. He had been distracted by Vanessa, by the hotel suite, by 14 months of not being in the rooms where the decisions that mattered were being made. And while he was distracted, someone had quietly and methodically assembled a version of his life that, from the outside, from the perspective of a federal investigator looking at a FinCEN disclosure, told a very specific story. And the story they had assembled was one Roman could not easily contradict without resources he no longer had access to, attorneys he could no longer afford to retain without cash, he could no longer freely move, and time he did not have. He picked the phone back up. Chen, how long before the federal timeline forces a decision? If the disclosure is as specific as Vincent described, and if investigators move on it, 30 days, maybe 20. After that, you're looking at a subpoena stage, and everything becomes public record. Thank you. He hung up. He sat on the edge of the bed in the anonymous hotel room, and he was very quiet for a long time. Then he called Vincent. I need everything you have on the organization's current operational documentation, Roman said when Vincent answered. The ledgers, the Bridgeport network contacts, the Keller arrangement records, all of it. Physical copies, not digital. Get them out of the office and secure them somewhere nobody connected to Meridian or to Isabella's attorneys can access. Vincent's voice was careful, cautious in a way that was different from the caution of this morning. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if the federal case moves forward with fabricated documentation, the only leverage I have is the organization's operational records. Information that implicates people who currently believe they are protected, people who will pay significantly to remain protected. Silence. That's a very dangerous position to take, Vincent said. I'm already in a dangerous position. What you're describing, using the organization's records as leverage, that is a line, Roman. Once you cross it, the people on the other side of it will not distinguish between you going to the government and you simply being a threat. The response will be the same either way. I know what the response will be. Then you know what I know what I'm considering, Roman said. I said I need the records secured. I haven't said what I'm going to do with them. Get them secured. Vincent was quiet for 3 seconds. All right. And Vincent? Roman paused. When you get to the office, check the secondary archive on the 3rd floor. The physical file cabinet, the one with the 2018 and 2019 operational contracts. I need to know if anything has been moved. I'll check. Call me the moment you're inside. He hung up. He stood at the window of the Marriott and looked at the gray sky over the Connecticut interstate. And he thought about Isabella standing at the bottom of his staircase in her black suit. And he thought about Vanessa's voice going flat on the phone when the warmth drained out of it. And he thought about the document in the Meridian archive bearing his signature and describing a financial arrangement he had never authorized. And he thought about the federal timeline and the 30 days, and the Manhattan attorney, and the fabricated paper trail, and the offshore account that was now flagged in a federal database. He thought about all of it. And then, for the first time in 12 years, Roman DeLuca did something he had not done since he was 29 years old, and running errands for an organization that could have gotten him killed at any moment, and he had known it. He felt genuinely, completely, and irrevocably afraid. His phone buzzed. A text from Vincent. 4 words. Cabinet is already empty. Roman stared at the 4 words on the screen. The physical files. The 2018 and 2019 operational contracts. The only paper documentation of the organization's structure that existed outside of encrypted digital systems. The backup that Roman had maintained specifically because he did not trust digital systems. Specifically because he understood that digital records could be accessed and altered and fabricated while physical documents required a physical presence. Someone had been in that cabinet. Someone who knew it existed, knew its location, knew its contents, and had removed everything in it. Not recently, not this morning, not in the chaos of the last 12 hours, but at some point before any of this began, before the envelope on the kitchen island, before the board vote at midnight, before the FinCEN disclosure 4 days ago, before any moment Roman could point to as the beginning of his unraveling. Someone who had been inside his operation, someone who had been inside his organization's most protected physical records. And Roman looked at the text on his screen and understood, with a cold and absolute certainty that settled into him like water filling a container, that the person who had taken those files was not Vanessa King, who had never been inside that office, and was not Isabella's attorneys, who had no knowledge of the organization's operational structure. The only people who knew that cabinet existed were the people Roman had trusted completely. He stood at the window. He thought about Vincent's voice this morning, careful, cautious. The voice of a man choosing his words like he stood at the window. He thought about Vincent's voice this morning, careful, cautious. The voice of a man choosing his words like footing on unstable ground. And he thought about the 3 weeks Vincent had waited before telling him about Vanessa's meetings with Harrow. And he thought about the cabinet, the physical cabinet on the 3rd floor that only 4 people in the world knew existed. And he counted those 4 people on the fingers of one hand, and he came to the same name every time he counted. He called Vincent. It rang once, twice, 3 times. 4. Voicemail. Roman ended the call. He stood very still. He called again. Voicemail again, faster this time, as if the call had been declined rather than missed. He put the phone in his pocket. He picked up his jacket from the bed where he'd set it. He put it on. He walked to the door of the hotel room and opened it and walked down the corridor to the elevator with the measured pace of a man who is not running because running attracts attention, and attention is the one thing he cannot afford, but whose body is operating at a frequency that is functionally identical to running in every way except the visible one. He had no car. The Porsche was at the estate behind gates that no longer responded to his code. He walked out of the hotel into the parking lot and stood in the cold for 2 seconds before pulling out his phone and opening a rideshare app and typing the address of the Meridian offices in Stamford. The car arrived in 4 minutes. A silver Civic driven by a man who did not look at Roman, which was fine. Roman sat in the back seat with his phone in his hand and called Chen. "I need you to cross-reference something," Roman said. "The credential logs you mentioned, the 2 administrator accounts added to the Meridian system 14 months ago. I need the IP addresses of the sessions when those accounts access the 2019 documentation." "I can pull that." "And I need the access logs on the physical security system for the Stamford office, the 3rd floor specifically, any entry events for the past 18 months. The physical security logs are managed by the building system. I don't have direct access to." "Find someone who does. Call the building manager, call the security company. I don't care. I need those logs within the hour." He ended the call. The Civic moved through Stamford's morning traffic. The city was fully awake now, the streets filling with the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday. Commuters, delivery trucks, a school bus stopped with its red lights going at a crosswalk where 3 kids in heavy coats crossed without looking up from their phones. Roman watched it through the window and felt entirely outside of it, as if the glass between him and the street was thicker than it appeared, as if he were watching the world through something that was not quite transparent. 22 years. He had known Vincent Moretti for 22 years. He had been in rooms with this man that neither of them would ever speak about. He had trusted him with the operational records precisely because he trusted no one else with them. And the specificity of that trust, the singularity of it, was now the most damning piece of evidence in front of him. He thought about the things Vincent had said this morning, the things he had been first to say. Vanessa's meetings with Harrow. Vincent had raised that, had produced the photograph, had positioned himself as the man bringing Roman crucial intelligence, and Roman had taken it as loyalty. He thought about what that intelligence had done. It had focused Roman's attention on Vanessa, had made Vanessa the betrayal, the explanation, the target for Roman's fury. While the cabinet on the 3rd floor, the one thing that could tell Roman the true shape of what had been done to him, was already empty, already gone. The Civic stopped in front of the Meridian building. Roman got out. The lobby was marble and glass, 20 stories of legitimate corporate architecture that Roman had spent 8 years constructing as the public face of his operation. The security desk was staffed by 2 men he recognized, had employed technically through the building management contract. The one on the left, a heavy-set man named Garrett, who had worked the desk for 4 years, looked up when Roman walked in and then looked away and picked up his phone. Roman was at the desk in 6 strides. "Don't make that call," Roman said. Garrett looked at him. His hand was on the phone but not yet dialing. "I need to go to the 3rd floor," Roman said. "I'm going to walk to the elevator and go to the 3rd floor, and you are not going to call anyone until I am in that elevator. Do you understand?" Garrett looked at him for a long moment. He was not afraid of Roman. He was a security professional doing a job, and the job today had apparently been briefed to include instructions about Roman DeLuca. But he was also a man who had watched Roman DeLuca walk through this lobby for 8 years with the specific authority of someone who owned the air inside the building, And that kind of authority leaves a residue that one board resolution cannot entirely clean. He put the phone down. Roman walked to the elevator. The third floor was mid-level administrative, records management, compliance archives, the kind of floor that no one visited unless they specifically needed to, which was why Roman had put the cabinet there. He walked off the elevator and down the corridor, past the open plan compliance office where 3 people were at their desks, and looked up at him with the startled recognition of people who had been told something and were now seeing that something walked toward them. And none of them moved or spoke because none of them had been specifically told what to do if he appeared in person. He went to the records room at the end of the corridor. He used the keypad. His code still worked here, either because no one had thought to revoke it, or because the revocation order hadn't filtered down to the physical security systems yet. The door opened. The filing cabinet was in the back corner, gray steel, 4 drawers. He pulled the top drawer. Empty. He pulled the second. Empty. Third, fourth, empty, empty, all of it. Every file gone without even the hanging brackets left behind, just clean bare metal runners that caught the fluorescent light. He stood in front of the empty cabinet and breathed. Then he heard footsteps in the doorway behind him. He turned. Vincent Moretti was standing in the doorway of the records room. He was in his coat, his silver hair slightly disordered in the way that suggested he had come quickly from somewhere and had not stopped to straighten it. And his face, Roman looked at his face and read it the way he had read this face for 22 years. And what he read there was not guilt exactly, not the guilty face of a man caught in a betrayal, but something more complicated and more exhausted. The face of a man who has made a decision he can't unmake and has known for a long time that this moment was coming. They looked at each other across the records room. "You declined my calls," Roman said. "I was driving." "You declined them." Vincent came into the room. He let the door close behind him. He put his hands in his coat pockets and he stood 6 feet from Roman, and he did not look away, which was, Roman thought, to his credit. A lesser man would have looked away. "How long?" Roman said. Vincent's jaw moved. He took a breath. "Roman, how long?" 2 years. The words came out flat and direct, the way Vincent did everything when he finally decided to do it. "I've been in contact with Isabella's people for 2 years. The number landed. Roman absorbed it. 2 years of this man in his passenger seat, across his desk, in his confidence. 2 years of sitting in the study on the morning the world ended and saying, I didn't know, while knowing precisely. "The cabinet," Roman said. "Secured. The files are secured." "By you." "Yes." "For them." Vincent's eyes held his. "For the purpose of making sure that the people in those files are not exposed in a federal proceeding that you would not survive." "Roman, listen to me." His voice sharpened. "Those files name 43 individuals, associates, contractors, people connected to the Bridgeport network. If those files reach a federal investigation the way you were thinking about using them this morning as leverage, those people become targets. And before they become targets, they become threats. To you. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I removed those files to protect you from yourself. You removed those files because Isabella's attorneys needed them clean. I removed those files because 2 years ago, Isabella Blackthorne came to me and told me what she knew about the 2019 Cayman structure, and what she knew was enough, on its own, without the files, without Vanessa, without any of the rest of it, to put you in federal custody, and she offered me a choice." Roman's hands were at his sides. He could feel his pulse in his palms. He kept his hands at his sides. "She offered you a choice," Roman said. "She said, and I'm going to tell you exactly what she said because you deserve that much. She said that she was leaving and that she was taking what was hers and that the federal exposure was going to happen regardless of what I did because she had already provided enough information to investigators that the process was moving on its own momentum. And she said that I could spend the next 2 years warning you and watching you make it worse, or I could help manage it in a way that contained the damage." He paused. "She was right, Roman. About all of it. She was right." The fluorescent light hummed above them. Somewhere on the other side of the door, the compliance office was very quiet. People not making sounds they didn't have to make. "Manage the damage," Roman said. "Is that what you told yourself?" I told myself that you had been making decisions for 12 years that were going to end this way one way or another, and that the question was whether it ended with only you going down, or whether it ended with 43 people going down alongside you. Vincent's voice was not defensive. It was tired, and tired was more honest than defensive, and Roman knew it. I told myself that I had my own exposure, that the files implicated me as much as they implicated you, and that Isabella's terms gave me a path out that you had never thought to give me. What were her terms? Cooperation, the files. My testimony regarding the Meridian restructuring, confined to the corporate transactions and not extending to the operational side. A pause. And the document in the archive, the substituted document. Roman looked at him. That was yours, Roman said. The swap was my work. Yes. No hesitation. Isabella's attorneys had your signature on the original transfer authorization. They needed a document that contextualized the Cayman account in terms that the FinCEN disclosure would make immediately actionable. I did the technical work. He held Roman's gaze. I'm not going to tell you I feel good about it. You fabricated evidence against me. I provided a document that accurately describes what the Cayman account was used for. The language is more explicit than you would have authorized. The purpose it describes is the purpose it served. Vincent's voice did not waver. I did not fabricate the account. I did not fabricate the transactions. I made them legible. Roman moved. He crossed the 6 feet between them in 2 strides, and his right hand was at Vincent's collar before either of them had fully processed that it was happening. And Vincent's back hit the filing cabinet with a sound like a struck bell. And they stood there with Roman's fist at his throat and Vincent's hands not raised in defense but hanging at his sides. And Vincent looked at him steadily, without flinching, with the worn patience of a man who had accepted what was coming and was not going to fight it. And that, the not fighting, was what stopped Roman. Not the physical reality of it, not the calculation of consequences, the simple fact of Vincent's stillness, the deliberate chosen quality of it. Roman released him. He stepped back. He turned away and put one hand on top of the empty filing cabinet and stood there with his back to Vincent and his chest moving. She gave you a path out, Roman said. His voice was rough. And you took it. Yes, without telling me. If I had told you, you would have gone to war with her. You would have brought everything down on top of all of us trying to stop something that couldn't be stopped. Vincent straightened his collar. His voice was quieter now. I've spent 22 years watching you win because you were smarter and harder than the people in your way. Isabella is smarter than you, Roman. I needed you to understand that, and the only way you were ever going to understand it was to let it happen. Roman pushed off the cabinet. He turned around. His face was controlled, but his eyes were doing something that control couldn't reach. A hot and fractured quality that was the visible surface of something breaking down in a place no discipline could get to. Get out of my way, he said. Roman, get out of my way, Vincent. Vincent stepped aside. Roman walked out of the records room. He walked down the corridor past the compliance office, where the 3 employees were now pointedly not looking at the corridor, past the elevator, to the stairwell at the end of the hall. And he went down the stairs because he could not stand still in an elevator right now. Could not stand in a small enclosed space while his body was doing what it was doing. He came out in the lobby. Garrett at the security desk looked up. Roman walked past him and through the glass doors into the cold. He stood on the sidewalk. He stood there for 30 seconds and did nothing, which was the closest he had come to collapse all morning, and then he pulled out his phone and called Marcus Chen back. I need the IP logs now, Roman said, and I need you to pull every communication record between Vincent Moretti and anyone connected to Blackthorn, Harrow, and Associates for the past 24 months. Every email, every calendar entry, every access log where his credentials appear in proximity to the 2019 documentation. Roman, if Moretti had administrator access, can you pull it or not? I can pull it, but if he had admin-level access, the records could be edited. I can look for gaps, anomalies. Pull everything you can and get it to me before noon. I have a meeting with an attorney. Understood. Chen paused. There's something else. Roman closed his eyes briefly. Say it. I've been going through the Meridian board communications from last night, the midnight meeting. I was able to access the pre-meeting correspondence through a shared server that hasn't been locked down yet. Another pause. Roman, Isabella's attorney sent a communication to the board members at 9 p.m. last night, 3 hours before the meeting. Attached to it was a summary document. The summary included a section titled Federal Exposure Assessment, and it outlined the FinCEN disclosure and the expected investigative timeline. She told the board about the federal exposure before the vote, which means every board member who voted to remove you did so, knowing that a federal investigation was likely incoming. They weren't just voting on a corporate governance issue. They were managing liability. They were getting out from under you before the roof came down. Roman opened his eyes. How many of them knew before last night? He said. Based on what I'm seeing, at least 3 of the 7 had prior contact with Isabella's counsel. The vote wasn't a surprise to them. They'd been prepared. He stood on the sidewalk with the phone at his ear and looked at the glass face of the Meridian building. His building. The building he had spent 8 years constructing as the architecture of his legitimacy. And he looked at his own reflection in it, distorted and dark. The figure of a man standing alone on a sidewalk with the world realigned around him. 48 hours ago, he had been a man with $100 million, an empire, a wife, a mistress, and a partner. He had woken up this morning in a hotel suite smelling of someone else's perfume with the comfortable certainty of a man who owned everything that mattered. Now he had $2.3 million in a New Haven account, a Manhattan attorney he hadn't yet met, and the knowledge that the man he had trusted more than any person alive had spent 2 years quietly and methodically dismantling everything he built. He had one move left. One move that could not be taken back, that would permanently and irrevocably alter the nature of his situation. Not to his advantage, not to any clean or recoverable outcome, but to the only outcome still available to a man who has lost the board and the pieces and is sitting across from an opponent who has already won and is simply waiting for the concession. He was going to burn it down. Not the way Isabella had built her case, patiently, invisibly, with the long discipline of someone playing the endgame from the opening move. The other way. The Roman DeLuca way, which was fast and total and without concern for collateral, which was the way that had gotten him here in the first place, and which was the only language he had left. He was going to take everything he knew, every offshore account, every shell corporation, every name in the Bridgeport network, every financial instrument and criminal arrangement and buried transaction from 14 years of operations, and he was going to walk into the office of a federal investigator, and he was going to put it on the table, not to cooperate, not to save himself. The fabricated document in the Meridian archive had closed that door. But to detonate, to make the damage so comprehensive and so final that Isabella's carefully constructed separation from the criminal side of the empire became irrelevant, because there would be no empire left for anyone to separate from, to take Vincent down with him, to take the board members, to take the Bridgeport network, to make the wreckage so complete that the only story anyone could tell about Roman DeLuca was not the story of a man who was outmaneuvered, but the story of a man who, at the end, took the entire structure down with his own hands. He pulled up Richard Falk's number. He started to dial, and then a black SUV pulled to the curb 12 feet in front of him, and the passenger door opened, and a man got out who was not Richard Falk, and was not anyone connected to Isabella or Meridian or any of the moving parts of Roman's collapsing world. He was a large man in a gray overcoat, mid-50s, with the flat patient face of a federal agent so thoroughly that Roman identified him as such before he had taken 2 steps on the sidewalk, the way you identify a predator not by any single feature, but by the totality of how it moves. Behind him, a second man got out of the driver's side, Mr. DeLuca. The man in the gray overcoat reached into his coat and produced a credential wallet, flipping it open with the practiced one-handed movement of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Special Agent Carver, FBI. I wonder if you'd be willing to... Roman looked at the credential wallet for exactly 2 seconds. Not because he needed 2 seconds to read it, because he needed 2 seconds to make a decision, and the decision was the last real one available to him. And he understood that clearly and without drama, in the way that certain things become clear when every other option has been removed and only the truth of a situation remains. He could run. The thought arrived and departed in under a second, that not because he was incapable of it, but because he understood what running meant at this stage, with a federal flag on the Cayman account and fabricated documentation in the Meridian archive, and Vincent Moretti already cooperating on the other side of a wall Roman could no longer see over. Running meant becoming a fugitive with $2.3 million and no infrastructure. And fugitives with $2.3 million lasted approximately as long as it took for that money to run out. He could fight. He could refuse to speak, lawyer up on the sidewalk, make Carver and his partner execute the formal process of an arrest or a voluntary interview request, buy himself the time to reach Falk, and build a defense from whatever wreckage could be assembled. That was the rational move. That was what a man with resources and counsel and options did. He had resources. He had counsel lined up. He had one option. Mr. DeLuca, Carver said again, patient and flat, the credential still open in his hand. Roman looked at him. He looked at the second agent, still at the front of the SUV, hands at his sides, the studied stillness of someone covering a perimeter. He looked at the Meridian building behind him, its glass face reflecting the gray sky and the street, and the small cluster of 3 men on the sidewalk that nobody walking past was looking at directly, the way people in cities learn not to look directly at certain kinds of scenes. "I'd like to call my attorney," Roman said. "Of course." Carver's voice did not change. "We're not placing you under arrest, Mr. DeLuca. We're requesting a voluntary conversation. You're free to have counsel present." He paused one beat. "We think it would be in your interest to have that conversation before the day is out." "Why today?" Carver looked at him steadily. "Because the paperwork we file tomorrow will not include the word voluntary." Roman called Falk from the sidewalk. Falk answered on the second ring this time. The earlier message had apparently recalibrated his availability, and Roman gave him the address and the name Carver and said, "I need you here in 45 minutes, and Falk said 30 and hung up. They waited in the lobby of a coffee shop 2 doors down from the Meridian building. Carver ordered nothing. His partner stood near the door. Roman sat across from Carver at a small table and drank a black coffee he didn't taste and looked at the federal agent and thought about Vincent. "You've been in contact with someone in my organization?" Roman said. Carver looked at him without expression. "I'm not going to discuss the investigation before your attorney arrives." "I'm not asking about the investigation. I'm telling you something." Roman set the cup down. "Whatever cooperation you've received, whatever the source of your current information, I want you to know that I am aware of it, and I want you to factor that into whatever arrangement you're prepared to offer." Carver looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more the adjustment of a man recalculating a variable that has shifted. "Your attorney should be present for that conversation," Carver said. "He will be." Falk arrived in 28 minutes. He was a small, precise man in his early 60s with a silver tie and the kind of calm that comes not from temperament, but from 3 decades of sitting across tables from federal agents and understanding exactly how much of what they presented was performance. He shook Roman's hand once, firm and brief, and sat down and looked at Carver. "What are you offering?" Falk said. "We'd like to discuss the Cayman account and the Meridian transaction structure from 2019. In exchange for cooperation and full disclosure regarding the operational side of Mr. DeLuca's enterprise, names, structures, financial flows." Carver's voice was even and unhurried. "In exchange, we're prepared to discuss charging considerations." "Prepared to discuss is not an offer," Falk said. "No, it isn't." Carver looked at Roman. "We have a document in the Meridian archive that connects Mr. DeLuca directly to the Cayman account with language that is, frankly, more explicit than anything we usually see. We have a FinCEN disclosure from a credible individual source, and we have testimony from a cooperating witness who has been working with us for," a pause, deliberate, "some time." He let that land. "What we don't have is the operational structure, the Bridgeport network, the Keller arrangement. The names that don't appear in any corporate document because they were kept in a physical file that has recently become unavailable to us." Roman looked at Carver. "Your cooperating witness removed those files," Roman said. Falk put a hand on Roman's arm. Roman ignored it. "Your cooperating witness removed those files before providing you with the FinCEN disclosure," Roman said, "which means he provided you with enough to open the investigation while simultaneously eliminating the documentation that would have expanded its scope. He gave you me. He kept everyone else clean." He looked at Carver. "That's the deal he made, and you took it." Carver's face did not change, but the stillness of it had a different quality now. "The cooperation agreement we have in place is not something I can discuss," Carver said. "You don't have to." Roman leaned back. He looked at Falk. Vincent Moretti has been your source for how long? Falk looked at him with the neutral attentiveness of a man cataloging information for later use. 14 months, Roman said. Not to Carver, to himself, working it through. He started feeding information to Isabella's attorneys and to the Bureau at approximately the same time Vanessa entered my life, which means he helped engineer the distraction. He thought about it. Or she was his idea, Vanessa. Someone connected to the investigation reaching out through channels that looked like a social introduction. He looked at Carver. Was she an asset? Silence, which was an answer. Roman laughed. The same short, rough sound as before. In the hotel room, the sound that wasn't about anything being funny. She was your asset, he said. 14 months, planted, and her job was to keep me in hotel suites and out of the Meridian board meetings while Vincent moved the pieces. He shook his head once. I have to admit that's good work. Mr. DeLuca, Falk's voice was careful and firm. I need you to stop talking. Roman stopped talking. They moved to the FBI field office in New Haven 3 hours later. The conference room was the standard configuration. Long table, water pitchers, acoustic tile ceiling, the aggressive fluorescence of a space designed for clarity rather than comfort. Carver sat across from Roman and Falk with a second agent and a stenographer, and what happened over the following 4 hours was the systematic, methodical, and comprehensive demolition of everything Roman DeLuca had spent 14 years building. He did not give them the Bridgeport network. He did not give them the Keller arrangement names. He gave them the financial structure, the Cayman account, the 2019 transactions, the Shell Corporation arrangement, because those were already exposed, and fighting them with a fabricated document in the archive was a fight he and Falk had discussed in 90 seconds and agreed he could not win. He gave them Meridian's complicity in the laundering operation, which he could document independently of Vincent's cooperation and which reduced rather than expanded his own criminal liability by demonstrating that the corporation had been used against his interests as well as on his behalf. And he gave them the document. Not to exonerate himself, Falk had been clear that the substitution argument was fragile and that pursuing it aggressively would look retaliatory and undermine the cooperation credit. He gave them the document in the way Falk had advised. As a factual disclosure of a forensic anomaly that the Bureau's own technical people could evaluate, placed in the record without argument, a seed that might grow into something useful later or might not. But that existed now as an official notation that the primary piece of documentary evidence against Roman DeLuca had metadata inconsistencies consistent with post-creation modification. It was not a victory. It was a marker. The kind of marker you plant not because you expect to win the ground, but because you want the ground on the record. When they walked out of the field office at 6:47 in the evening, the sky was dark and the air had gotten colder, and Roman stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building and breathed it in. Falk stood beside him. The charging decision will take 60 to 90 days. Based on what you gave them and what they already have, you're looking at federal fraud and conspiracy charges related to the Meridian transactions, the Cayman exposure, money laundering derivative charges. He paused. The cooperation credit will matter at sentencing. We'll work every angle on the document anomaly. I won't tell you the outcome is good, but I'll tell you it's survivable. Roman looked at the dark sky. Survivable, he said. It's what I can offer right now. Falk picked up his briefcase. Don't talk to Moretti. Don't talk to anyone connected to Meridian or the Blackthorn attorneys. If Vanessa King attempts contact, document it and send it to me. Go to the hotel, stay there, and let me work. He looked at Roman, and Roman, don't do anything to make this worse. He left. Roman stood on the sidewalk alone for a long time. Then he started walking. No destination, no car, no particular direction, just the physical necessity of movement, of putting one foot in front of the other through the New Haven streets while the city did what cities do at 7 in the evening, all lit windows and passing cars and the smell of restaurant kitchens and the particular loneliness of being in a crowd that has no idea you exist. He walked for an hour. He ended up at the waterfront. The harbor was black and cold, the lights of the city reflected in it in broken pieces, and Roman sat down on a bench that looked out at the water and put his hands on his knees and sat there. His breath came out in visible clouds in the cold air. He was tired in a way that went below the physical, a tiredness that lived in the connective tissue of things. In the structure of a man who has been operating at a sustained level of intensity for so long that the cessation of that intensity feels less like rest and more like a kind of dissolution. He thought about Isabella. Not strategically, not with the calculating assessment that had defined his thinking about her all morning. Just thought about her. The 12 years of her. The breakfast she made every morning that he ate without comment. The way she had stood at the top of the stairs in the Greenwich house the night they moved in, looking down at him with an expression he had categorized as wifely satisfaction and had never reconsidered. The photograph of her mother on the nightstand that he had privately found oppressive and had never asked about. He thought about what she had said at the bottom of the stairs. I was real. Every day for 12 years, I was real. He believed it. That was the thing he kept returning to, sitting on the bench by the harbor in the cold. He believed it. He had not given her anything worth being real for, had not offered her the basic attention that a person requires to know they are seen, had spent 12 years treating the most intelligent and patient and strategically capable person in his life as ambient furniture. And she had been real anyway. She had loved him, he suspected. Not the performed version, not the contractual version, but actually, genuinely, in the stubborn way that certain people love things that are not good for them, because they see in them something worth seeing even when the thing cannot see itself. And the day she stopped loving him was not the day she found the hotel receipt. He understood that now. The day she stopped loving him was the day she understood that he was not going to change, and that the love she had been offering him was a resource he had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, not to value. After that day, she had simply become something else, still present, still composed, still the impeccable wife at the dinner table and the board meeting and the charity function, but operating from a different place entirely. Operating from the cold, clear altitude of a woman who has said goodbye to something and is now managing the departure. He had never noticed the difference. That was the thing that would stay with him longest, he thought. Not the losses, the house, the money, the empire, the freedom that was now running on a countdown toward a federal charge. Not even Vincent's betrayal, which he understood if he was honest with himself, which he was only now, at the end, capable of being. The thing that would stay was the simplest and most irrefutable fact of all of it. He had not noticed. He had been in the room with her for 12 years, and he had not noticed. He sat by the harbor until the cold became genuinely uncomfortable, and then he stood and walked back to the street and got a ride back to the Marriott in Stamford. The room was exactly as he had left it. Anonymous, clean, impersonal, in the particular way of spaces that exist to be occupied and vacated and occupied again without leaving any trace of the occupant. He sat on the edge of the bed, and he did not turn on the television, and he did not make any calls, and he did not look at his phone for a long time. Then he picked it up. There were no new calls from Vanessa. There were 2 from Caruso, his original attorney, which he didn't answer. There was one from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be a reporter from the Hartford Courant when he listened to the voicemail, which meant that the story was already moving, already becoming public record in the way that federal investigations become public record. Once enough parties are aware of them to make containment impossible. There was one text from a number he recognized but had not expected. Isabella. 4 words. The house is yours tonight. He read it 3 times. He did not understand it at first, and then he did. She was at the estate, had been there all day with the attorneys and the executives and the security, and she was telling him she would not be there tonight, that he could go back to the house he had built and sleep in it one last time before the legal process moved it into the contested column, and eventually, in the way these things went, out of his possession entirely. He sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the text. He didn't go. Not that night. He sat in the Marriott room and he thought about going and he chose not to, because going back to the house tonight, walking through the rooms that were already more hers than his, standing in the kitchen where the envelope had sat on the island that morning, would have been a performance for an audience of 1, and Roman DeLuca had spent his entire life performing for audiences, managing impressions, constructing versions of himself that served the moment, and he was finished with that. Not reformed, not repentant, just finished. Too tired for it, too stripped of the energy that performance required. He texted back, "Thank you." He put the phone down. He lay back on the bed in his clothes and looked at the ceiling and listened to the interstate traffic through the window. the white noise of a world that continued its operations with complete indifference to the implosion of any individual life within it. And he felt, underneath the exhaustion and the fear and the particular grinding weight of a day that had taken everything he had and left him on a bed in a Marriott, something that was not peace and was not relief, but was in the territory of both, a terrible simplicity. The simplicity of a man who has nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to perform. He slept. The next 60 days happened the way hard things happen. Not cleanly, not in a straight line, but with the grinding incremental progression of a process that has been set in motion and will not stop until it reaches its conclusion. Falk worked. Roman stayed in the Marriott, and then, when the $2.3 million began to feel the pressure of daily expenses and attorney fees, moved to a smaller place in Bridgeport, a furnished apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of cooking from the unit below and had a window that faced another building's brick wall. He did not reach out to Vincent Moretti. He received through Falk a formal notification that Vincent had entered into a cooperation agreement with the federal government. The terms were not disclosed to Roman in detail, but Falk's read was that Vincent had provided substantial assistance regarding the Meridian transaction structure and had received in exchange a recommendation for reduced charges on his own exposure. He would face something, significantly less than Roman. Roman read the notification and put it down and did not think about it for the rest of that day. He thought about it the next day, and the day after that, and eventually the shape of it settled into something he could carry without it pulling him off balance at unexpected moments. Betrayal, he discovered, was not a wound that healed so much as one that calcified. It became part of the structure, harder than the tissue around it, permanent, incorporated. He thought about Vincent every day for years. The charges came down 44 days after the field office interview. Federal fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud derivative charges. 4 counts. Falk characterized it as restrained given the documentation the government held, which was the attorney's way of saying they could have done worse and chose not to, which was itself a message Roman received clearly. The cooperation credit had mattered. The voluntary interview, the financial disclosure, the document anomaly placed in the record, these things had not saved him, but they had shaped the contour of what he was facing. He pled guilty to 2 counts. The negotiation took 3 weeks and aged Falk visibly, and cost Roman a sum of money that reduced the New Haven account to a figure he did not like to look at. The agreement called for a sentencing recommendation of 5 to 7 years. The judge, a woman in her late 60s who had been on the federal bench for 20 years and whose face during the sentencing hearing conveyed neither sympathy nor its absence, but simply the focused attention of someone doing a job that required precision, sentenced him to 5 years in federal custody. He was 51 years old. He reported to the Federal Correctional Facility in Danbury, Connecticut, on a Tuesday morning in September, 8 months after the morning he had come home from a hotel suite and found an envelope on a kitchen island. He drove himself there. Falk had offered to accompany him, and Roman had declined, in a rented car because he had no car of his own, and he parked in the visitor lot because he was not yet certain where the other lot was, and he sat in the parked car for 4 minutes before getting out. The facility was low-security federal. The grounds were institutional in the particular American way of institutional, flat, utilitarian, surrounded by a fence that was more administrative than physical in its message. Roman had spent decades building spaces that communicated power through architecture. This building communicated the opposite, the systematic, impersonal authority of a structure that did not need to impress anyone because everyone inside it had already been reduced to a status that made impression irrelevant. He got out of the car. He stood in the parking lot with a single bag. Falk had given him a list of what was permitted. And he looked at the building, and he breathed, and then he walked toward the entrance with the measured pace of a man who still, even now, after all of it, could not entirely bring himself to look as if he were walking somewhere he did not choose to go. Prison was not what he had imagined, which was its own kind of instruction. He had imagined it in cinematic terms. Violence, hierarchy, the brutal, compressed society of men with nothing to lose. There was some of that. There was more ordinary time, more quiet, more of the specific texture of days that are identical, that accumulate without distinction, that teach you whether you are the kind of person who can exist inside of repetition without dissolving. He discovered that he was. He read. He had not been a reader outside of professional necessity, and he became one here not out of aspiration, but out of the absence of alternatives. And what he discovered in books was something he had never expected to find in them. other people's interiority. The private texture of other minds working through the same fundamental confusions that had organized his life without his ever knowing they were confusions. He read like a man who has been handed a translation of something he thought was untranslatable. He did not write to Isabella. He wanted to in the first year, multiple times. He composed letters in his head, not apologies exactly, because the architecture of apology felt inadequate to the scale of what he had done and not done, but something more honest. An accounting. I see it now is what he wanted to say. I see it, and I know that seeing it now is worth nothing to you, and I'm not writing to ask you for anything. I'm writing because I want there to be a record somewhere, in someone's possession, that I finally looked. He never sent them. He was not sure, examining the impulse honestly, that they were entirely without the desire for something in return. Some acknowledgement, some softening, some version of resolution that served his own need for narrative closure. And Isabella did not owe him closure. He understood that. He kept the letters in his head where they belonged. In the third year, another man in his unit, older, a former real estate developer from Philadelphia, who had done something sufficiently similar to Roman's situation that they recognized each other with the weary familiarity of men who have been undone by parallel failures, brought a tablet to the common area one afternoon and called Roman over. "You should see this," the man said. His name was Gerald. He had a dry, undemonstrative manner that Roman found restful. On the tablet was a business interview recorded at a conference in Geneva. The production quality was high. A proper studio setup, professional lighting, the kind of presentation that signaled genuine institutional prestige rather than its simulation. On screen, Isabella. She was wearing a charcoal blazer, her hair down, the composed elegance of a woman who had grown so fully into her own authority that the authority was no longer something she was performing, but something she simply was. She looked, Roman searched for the word, settled. Not in the diminished sense of the word, not resigned or constrained. Settled in the way that structures are settled when they have found their proper foundation, when everything load-bearing is actually bearing load. Beside her, off-camera, but referenced in the chyron at the bottom of the screen, Vincent Moretti, chairman of the Meridian Foundation. Roman looked at that for a moment. Vincent. Of course. The deal Isabella had offered him 2 years before the divorce had included more than a path out of legal exposure. It had included a future, a place in the structure she was building. Roman had spent the first year in Danbury hating him for it with a cold and sustaining fury, and the second year understanding it, and the third year sitting with the understanding until it became simply a fact. One of the several irreversible facts of his life that he carried now without drama. The interviewer asked Isabella about the transformation of Meridian from a contested entity to one of the most successful development foundations in the Northeast. She said, "We removed what was holding us back and focused on building something that would outlast us." She did not say his name. Roman watched the full interview, 22 minutes. She spoke about the Foundation's international development projects, about a partnership with a European infrastructure group, about the philosophy of long-term investment that prioritized sustainability over short-term extraction. She spoke with the fluency of someone who had been thinking about these things for years and had finally been given the stage to say them without management or suppression or the ambient weight of a man who wasn't listening. She was extraordinary. Roman had known she was intelligent. He had categorized that intelligence as a domestic quality, useful for managing the household, appropriate for the nominal board position, functional in the social context where a CEO's wife was required to be presentable and composed. He had filed it under wife and left it there. What he was watching was not a wife. What he was watching was what Isabella Blackthorne had been the entire time, the full, uncontained version of a person he had spent 12 years partially observing. The interview ended. Gerald took the tablet back. He looked at Roman. "Someone you know?" "My ex-wife," Roman said. Gerald looked at the screen where the conference logo was now displayed, then back at Roman. He said nothing for a moment, then, "Damn." "Yeah," Roman said. He went back to his cell. He sat on the edge of the bunk, and he looked at the wall, and he thought about the morning in the kitchen of the Greenwich estate, when he had looked at the envelope on the island and felt afraid for the first time in years, and he thought about what the fear had actually been fear of. He had believed that morning that it was the fear of losing the empire, the money, the power, the architecture of dominance he had constructed. It wasn't. He understood that now, with the distance that only time and the particular honesty enforced by a small room can produce. What he had felt in that kitchen was not the fear of losing things, it was the fear of being seen. The sudden appalling recognition that someone had been watching him, actually watching, with attention and intelligence and the patient accumulation of evidence, and that what they had seen, documented across 47 photographs in 14 months and 12 years of shared life, was not the legend he had built in his own mind, but the actual man. The man who was careless with people. The man who confused fear for respect and control for love. The man who sat across from his own wife every morning for a decade and never once thought to ask what she was thinking. That was what he had been afraid of. Being seen clearly. It had taken 5 years in a federal facility and 22 minutes of a business interview to finish the understanding, but he was there now, on the other side of it, in possession of a fact about himself that he could not unknow and could not use retroactively and could not offer to anyone as evidence of growth or change, because the people it would have mattered to were gone and were not coming back. He was not reformed. He was not a better man in the sense that the word better implies a restoration of something good that had been temporarily lost. He was simply a man who had arrived, finally, at an accurate understanding of himself, which was the beginning of something if he chose to make it so. Or the end of everything, if he didn't. He chose to make it something. He did not know yet what. He had 2 years left on the sentence, and then a world outside that would look nothing like the one he had left. A world in which his name meant something specific and permanent, in which the structures that had defined his life were either gone or transformed or occupied by people who had built better things in their place. He would have the New Haven account, diminished but present. He would have Falk's network of contacts in legitimate real estate, which the attorney had mentioned once as a possible avenue, in the careful, circumspect way that good attorneys mention possibilities they do not want to be held to. He would have whatever he could build with his own hands in whatever time he had left, which was the same situation that every person in the world was in, and which he had for some reason believed himself exempt from. He lay back on the bunk. Above him, the ceiling of the cell was the same acoustic tile as the FBI conference room, the same flat institutional surface, the same indifferent containment. He looked at it, and he breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts, the old discipline, except this time the discipline was not performing stillness for a room that needed to believe he was in control. It was just breathing, just a man in a room, present in the room, not anywhere else, not managing the impression of being somewhere else. Just here. The lights in the corridor dimmed at 9. The sounds of the facility settled into its nighttime register, distant and muffled. The ordinary human sounds of 100 men arranged in adjacent spaces, each of them carrying the specific weight of their own particular unraveling. Roman closed his eyes. He did not think about the empire. He did not think about the money, or the mansion, or the 47 photographs on the kitchen island in what felt like another life. He thought about a morning a very long time ago when he was 23 years old and had nothing, no empire, no wife, no organization, no legend, and had stood on a street corner in Stamford with $1,200 in his pocket and the absolute certainty that the world owed him something larger than what it had so far offered. He had been wrong about that. The world owed him nothing. Everything he had gotten, he had taken. And everything he had taken, he had eventually lost, not to enemies or rivals or the patient long game of a woman he had underestimated, but to the weight of his own convictions, the conviction that control was love, that fear was loyalty, that the silence of the people around him was consent rather than strategy. Those convictions had built the empire. Those convictions had cost him everything the empire was supposed to be for. He turned onto his side. Outside the facility, in the dark Connecticut night, the world continued without him. The traffic on I-84, the lights of Danbury visible through the facility's high windows as a pale diffusion in the sky. The ongoing, ordinary machinery of lives arranged around values he had spent 50 years not examining. And in Greenwich, or wherever she was now, Geneva perhaps, or New York, or some city he had never thought to follow her to, Isabella Blackthorne was building something that would outlast both of them, with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had always known exactly what she was doing and had waited with extraordinary patience for the space to do it. He did not begrudge her that. That was the last thing he thought before sleep came. He did not begrudge her. It was a small thing. It was possibly the smallest thing he had ever managed. But it was real, and it was his. And in the stripped-down economy of a man who had lost almost everything, real was the only currency that still held its value. The steel door of the corridor closed at the end of the hall. The lights went out. Roman DeLuca closed his eyes, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he did not dream of the Empire. He did not dream of anything at all.